Everyone, welcome to another YouTube video. This week we're going to be going over how to paint salamanders from the Space Marine chapter. Now, as always, I hope this is helpful. If you've got any questions or queries, please leave them in the comments below. If the video is helpful, feel free to hit that like button. Thank you very much for all the support. It means a huge amount. And as always, if you do want to support the channel and get additional content, feel free to check out the Patreon in the links below. But without further ado, here we go. So, the paints we're using for the green on this are P3 Nulls Green, which is what this model is base coated in. So it was primed in black and then base coated with P3 Nulls Green. The mid-tone colour, which is the colour that's going to give it the salamander tone, is going to be P3 Worm Green. And then we're going to add a small amount of Vallejo model colour white to that green later on to give it like a bit of a shine. Now, the main thing that we're going to start with is we need to sketch in where our highlights are going to be. So this P3 Nulls Green is really important. So we've got a nice deep dark shadow colour. You could push to black in areas if you wanted to, but as this is just an army standard Space Marine, I probably wouldn't bother personally. The other thing that I would say is not to panic too much about getting paint on the details. As long as your paint is not too thick, you're not going to obscure those details. So P3 paints tend to be quite transparent, so you don't need to thin them too much. So when I'm doing this, this is probably 2 or 3 parts paint to 1 part water. So the idea with this is when I put my brush stroke down, I want as opaque mark as possible. So you'll see when I place the paint on the model, this paint goes over in pretty much one coat. I don't want to be spending a huge amount of time painting this model. I don't want to have to do multiple coats of paint because it's just too much downtime. And I'm going to be working over this paint anyway when I blend them together. So what I'm doing is slapping down very solid marks and getting my highlights in place. And then the majority of the time gets spent blending those colors together. And you can see this green is already quite striking. I've never used this green before, but it's actually really nice. I think I'm going to try and use it more in the future. Now, what you will see when I'm sketching out, I'm using the side of my brush the majority of the time. And the reason for that is purely because it's a larger brush stroke, so it minimizes downtime. So it means that I'm just working faster. When I start blending it together, I'll change my brush strokes, but you can see it's really, really rough. Like the sketch stage, this is where all the decisions are made. This is where you make your choices about how your light is going to behave on the model, how striking you want it. So you should be able to work very, very quickly. And the idea with this is it's going to tell you very early on whether your color scheme is going to work, whether your lighting makes sense, or whether the model is just going to look good at all. Now, it's also worth noting I am only painting the front of this. This model is purely being done for a YouTube tutorial, so there's really no point in me painting the back. So when I rotate this model as it goes, you'll see that the model is completely unpainted on the back. That's just because I'm not actually using this for anything myself. Now, certain areas, depending on how thin I had my paint at different times, certain areas do need a second coat because you can see that it looks a little bit mottled. But again, because I'm using such large brush strokes, because I'm not being careful about the details, I can do that very, very quickly. Now, what I am noticing straight away is when I place this green on the model is I don't feel like the highlights are bright enough. I don't feel like this green is bright enough. It looks a little bit flat. So it was at this point that I decided that I was going to add some white into the mix later on. Now, it's up to you whether you want to do that or not. The thing is when we add white to the highlight later, it gives it a bit more of a shiny result, a bit closer to like a metallic result. So it's up to you whether you want to do that or not. It purely comes down to preference, so you can make your choice as is. Now, when it comes to blending this together, ultimately what I'm going to do is I'll mix a color between P3 Nulls Green and the P3 Worm Green. And what I'll do is I'll start painting in between the transitional areas. The idea with this is basically what it does is it starts to darken down that Worm Green. It starts to brighten up the Nulls Green. So we need to be very careful with that. So we want very small brush strokes, but we'll get into that. So you can see at the moment, priority is We want a consistent mid-tone color of this worm green, and we want to keep the gnarls green into the recesses. And then that's where our contrast is going to come from. And when I talk about contrast, I'm talking specifically in contrast in value here. That's all I really care about when it comes to army painting. And it depends on how experienced you are, but for me, I can see very early that this is going to work, that I like the volume placement. So it's just the case of blending them together now. It's up to you how you do it. You can either mix up a mid-tone, so you can mix up a colour between the worm green and the gnarls green, or you can use one of those to blend it together. So what you'll see at the moment is, if you notice, my brush stroke is going from the light green and it goes into the dark green. The reason for that is what I'm doing is the gnarls green is the darker green and it's more potent, it's more powerful. So if I start in areas of the model that have the light green, the worm green, I start my brush stroke in the worm green and then move it towards areas of the model with the gnarls green. What that means is it starts to darken down the bright highlight color, mid-tone color that I've got on the model already, and it smooths that transition between the two. And because the gnarls green is darker and much stronger, does it quicker than if I was to do it the other way around. So you could, for example, get the worm green on your paintbrush, and you could work from the darker area and end your brush stroke into the brighter areas on the model. But it would probably take a little bit longer because that paint is it's more transparent, so it would take much longer. The big thing that I would say with this is, it's really the fact that I'm not worried about all the details is actually a very important fact because of speed. If I was concerned about not painting over all the details, then what happens is I've got to be much more careful about all of my brush marks. It means that it slows me down a huge amount, and I really just don't have time for that. So the fact that I'm painting the armor first is really important. I'm painting the armor first because, first of all, it's the largest part of the model. Everyone is going to see this. So this is the part of the model that we need to put the most effort into. And also it means that I can just be really carefree and work as quickly as possible because I don't have to worry about going over any of the details that I've already painted. So from an army painting perspective, a speed painting perspective, that's really important. If you're doing a group of these all at once, then what will end up happening is, because you're batch painting them as well, that will speed everything up. Now, what I would say is the other way of doing this is you could do a bit of a wet blend. So you could wet blend it like I've shown on previous videos. That would speed things up quite a lot. I am placing a little bit of black in certain areas. So underneath the collar and underneath the front of the shoulder pad, underneath of the leg, just because those are areas that are so deep in shadow, like just having a solid black, although it's not the most interesting thing in the world, from a army perspective, when you look at it from the tabletop, that will be quite striking. I'm also painting in the shoulder pads at this point as well for the black shoulder pads. The reason for that is because this gives me a good idea on what the green actually looks like on the trim itself. Because the problem is, I've said this before, if we have if everything is really messy, it can almost confuse what we're trying to achieve. Like, we won't be able to see what we're achieving. So sometimes it's good to black out those details. This is where I decided I wanted to go, or sorry, this is where I decided that I was going to push this much brighter. So I added a small amount of white into the worm green, up to you how much you do. And then once again, just like the sketch stage, I'm slapping on that white. I'm not being particularly too careful. Slapping on the white into those brighter areas to see whether I like the result that I'm getting. And I think straight away this changes it. You'll notice as well that I'm not putting this white-green mix everywhere. I'm just putting it in small areas. So it's a very small highlight to make the armor pop. And more specifically around the head and what will be the backpack later on as well. By placing it on the shoulder pads and the peak of the head and the collar, what this does is it means that we've got these bright spots around the head. So instead of looking at the Marine as a whole, when we look at this model, what we're mainly going to see, what our eye is drawn to, is the top half of the model. So by making the highlights brighter on the shoulder pads, the collar and the helmet, we're drawn to the helmet and the chest. So we're not really interested. It's the legs are not drawing our eyes, the weapons are not drawing our eyes. These become secondary focal points. So this is something that can be really, really handy. If you can push the brightness towards one part of the model, everyone will look at that one part of the model. The priority now is we just need to blend all this together, which can be a little bit tedious, but it's got to be done. Now, what you could do if you wanted to at this stage of the sketch, because the transitions are not too bad, they're just a little bit rough. If you've got an airbrush, you could airbrush the worm green over the top of this, and it will bring it together quite quickly. So that would be a really good shortcut to take to speed up this transition. But it's up to you whether you want to do that or whether you're competent enough with an airbrush to be able to do it. But you can do it with a paintbrush. You just need to make sure that your paint is relatively thin. So when I'm glazing this together, or not necessarily glazing this together, when I'm blending it together, my paint, working with P3 paints, remember, so my paint in this case is thinned down to probably 1 part water to 1 part paint. So it's not really that thin. The main thing is that because I'm removing the excess from my brush, so I don't have a huge amount of paint on my brush, and I'm controlling the direction that I do my brush stroke, it's giving me a nice smoother transition and bringing it together. But as I said, you can do it with an airbrush if you want to. Now, what is happening is, as we're blending this together, what you'll notice is we lose some of that brightness that we had from adding the white. So sometimes you need to work back and forward. So where I've darkened it all down, where I've been smoothing the transitions out, now I'm going back with that white green tone where I added the Vallejo model color white to the P3 worm green, and I'm building that back up now, so we get those shine spots on the head, the shoulder pads, and the leg. The difference here is whereas in before I was doing it with a really, quite an opaque paint and just slapping it down on the model, this time I'm doing it much softer, so the paint is much thinner than it was before, probably 1 or 2 parts water to 1 part paint. And I'm building it up slower, so it's not quite so rough, so the transition is much nicer. Now, I say this in nearly all of my videos, what you need to remember is every paint is different, every color, brand, they're all different, they all behave differently. So there is no perfect paint consistency that I can give you, because that's going to change depending on the sort of paint that you're using. And this is really important for you to understand, because you need to make sure that you understand the paint consistency that you're aiming for. In this case, we're aiming for a fairly transparent paint consistency to smooth them together. Once you've got a transition that you like, remember, we haven't been careful with painting details or anything like that. This is the point where you go back and you start painting in your recesses. So those dark shadow lines that you should have, which have probably been covered in paint where you've been blending it together and working with it, you now need to bring those back. So paint those recesses in. Do that with a wash if you want. Personally, I just use a paint. Then your edge highlights need to go on. With the edge highlights, these are really important, because what these do is they give shape to your model. Your edge highlights are what makes the model readable from far away. So this is a really, really important feature to think about. You don't have to edge highlight every single edge. I can't stress this enough. You just need to edge highlight the ones where the ones that are going to clearly make it easy to understand what the shapes on the model are from far away. Now, I've done 2 sets of edge highlights on this. I've done all of the edges facing upwards, I've done with worm green, and then all of the edges that are facing upwards near my white green areas, I've done also a white green edge highlight. So that white green worm white mix, worm green and Vallejo model color white mix, I've highlighted those edges as well. So what this does, between the recess, painting in the recesses and adding in your edge highlights, this gives our model readability. Because the thing is, what you need to remember is when we look at something, our brain tries to fill in gaps very quickly and make sense what we're looking at. And without those edge highlights, without those recess washes, it can be quite difficult for us to quickly understand what we're looking at. And we're quite lazy, and especially when we're doing tabletop painting, we're looking at an army from the other side of the table. We don't have to want to spend ages like trying to understand what we're looking at. We should just be able to see it at a glance and understand exactly what it is. This is a really important thing to work towards when it comes to both army and display painting. So yeah, make sure that you get those in. I know not everyone's a fan of edge highlighting. You do not need them everywhere like Games Workshop does. That's not a dig, but you just don't need them everywhere, but you need them where they're relevant. Otherwise, all of the shapes just end up blending together, and that's not what you want at all. Lastly, if you want, this is what I did. I grabbed some basically white paint, and on the tip of the cone on the head, a bright spot on the head, and the shoulder pads on the collar, I put a small amount of white to really make that area shine. Remember, I want everyone to be looking at the head and the upper body, so by adding those small white areas, it makes it pop, and you're drawn into that area. The next thing that we're going to do is we're going to paint some flames. Now, I wanted to do this very simply, so the idea with this is, I haven't overthought it too much. I've just done these swirly lines which run next to each other. They're not particularly, the designs are not particularly great, to be honest. If I was spending a lot more time on them, I think we could get a much better result. But we're going for a rough flame shape. I'm using pure white paint. The only thing that I would say is get a decent white paint, because white's a bit of a nightmare and some paints are not particularly good. Again, I'm using Vallejo model color. That's a white that I particularly like. You don't have to be too careful about this. The point is we've got a pure black shoulder pad and we've got pure white paint. Can be a nightmare to cover, but the point of using pure white and pure black is they're very easy if you make a mistake to just paint over them. And the reason for the white is because what we're going to do next is we're going to paint yellow over it. Now this is P3 Cygnus yellow. P3 are just a really nice paint for me to use. I quite like them. We're now going to go over that white with the P3 Cygnus yellow. It takes a couple of coats, but the reason for this is it gives, by going over white, it gives us a nice vibrant yellow, which is what's really important here. So we want a solid opaque coat of yellow to go over all of the white, and this is going to be the source of the flame, the brightest point. So this is the bottom of the flames. What we're going to do then is grab a red paint. I think this was Games Workshop Corn Red. Any red will do that's fairly dark. Thin it down a lot to what's traditionally a glaze consistency, so maybe 6 or 7 parts water to 1 part paint. And then away from the bottom of the flames, glazing over the top of the flames into the black area. This will give you a transition from light to dark on the flames. It'll also tint the area of the black shoulder pads to more of a red, which kind of, it takes away the jarring effect that the black shoulder pads have, because pure jet black always looks quite unnatural. And it also makes, like, it integrates the flames into the shoulder pad a little bit more. It makes them look a little bit more natural. And then the rest of the model is just painting in the details. So the chainsword and the bolt gun, whatever it's called, I did a very rough wet blend and of black to grey, and then edge highlighted blade, and that was pretty much it. Remember, when it comes to army painting, most people are not going to be looking in detail at the rest of the model. They're going to look at it at a glance and think, yes, that looks good, and then move on. In this case, if we get the armor right and the armor looks good, we can save so much time on the details. You can see, like, the bolter casing we've got is that really rough wet blended transition and some edge highlights painted in the eyes. Eyes need to be done fairly carefully. I've done enough videos on eyes, so you should be able to see those on the rest of the YouTube videos. In this case, I've done the eyes red because they stand out against the green. The Oath of Moment, or whatever it's called, on the bottom of the leg is just going to be red with a black wash, and a bone color for the actual parchment with a brown wash. The metallics, the silver, all it is scale 75 heavy metal silver with a brown wash over it, and then all of the gold metallics on the chest eagle. All we're going to do with that again is scale 75 Victorian brass, and we're going to put a brown wash over them. So they're so simple. It's literally all of the, with the exception of the black on the sword and the bolter casing, doing a base coat and a wash. That's it. You don't need anything else. And the thing is, what you need to remember as well, we want everyone to be looking at the top half of this model. If you spend ages edge highlighting and making every single little detail crisp, what it does is it takes away from the head. So it's actually quite beneficial to paint everything else to a slightly lower standard, because then again, everyone will want to look at the head. You'll automatically be drawn to the head and that upper torso, which is really, really handy. So we're drawing the viewer's eye to where we want them to look. By doing that, it also saves us a lot of time on the rest of the model, because we don't need to spend as much time on it. And that's it. That's how I painted the salamander. So it is very straightforward. It would work if you used an airbrush as well. So the armor itself is P3 Knowles green, P3 worm green, and then add a little bit of white to it, and then either airbrush it together or brush blend it together. As always, cheers for watching. I hope it's been helpful. As always, any questions, queries, let me know. Leave them in the comments below, and I'll catch you later.